Hello everyone and welcome into yet another week of shows here at the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this Monday afternoon. We should have a great show, a great week of shows ahead for you. We'll be kicking things off today by talking about the bizarre split between Aaron Rodgers and the Jets and where he could potentially end up. 3 top contenders sit atop my personal list. Then, speaking of contention, we're going to switch over to the NBA. Now that the All-Star break has concluded, we're looking at the true contenders for the Larry O'Brien Trophy in the NBA this season. Then we'll be doing an interesting segment where we look a little bit ahead to the 2025 NFL season and ask ourselves the question, who will the Eagles, as the Super Bowl champions, play in the first game of the NFL season? Then we'll be talking about, as well, after our first NBA segment, the team is most under pressure after not just the All-Star break, but the trade deadline because of certain moves they made to win a championship and fast. And concluding with a European football segment, looking ahead to the summer transfer window and what some top clubs could be looking to do in that period of time. Without further ado, before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show in the network if you haven't done so already, to better keep up to date with all our new content. Or, if you do want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider availing yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to leave your opinions, feedback, any input you have for the show, as well as any tips and donations, which are also genuinely appreciated. You can do that at our website as well, gsmcpodcast.net. But just makes our show that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to it. Without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment, starting off by talking about the somewhat bizarre split between Aaron Rodgers and the Jets. Obviously, a new regime coming to New York, Aaron Glenn and Darren Mogi respectively, and they might have wanted a clean slate. And that's potentially why Aaron Rodgers didn't necessarily, get what he wanted, which he always seems to do for these certain moments in time, no matter who the coach is. And it's why I feel like his Jets tenure is not necessarily going to be remembered fondly in terms of how organizationally it led to inner turmoil and potentially firings that wouldn't necessarily have happened had Aaron Rodgers been there. But if you look at the underlying stats, the underlying metrics that Aaron Rodgers had in his only season as a New York Jet, he had 3,897 yards, 8th most in the NFL, and 28 touchdowns, 7th most last year. So it's not like his production completely waned. It's more like the dysfunctionality, not just within the coaching staff, but what with Aaron Rodgers adding that kind of element of power to it. I feel like that's what ultimately led to Aaron Glenn and Darren Mogi coming in and saying, we might want to just start anew. But the thing about this is, I don't necessarily believe it's all on Rodgers. I mean, some of it is making certain demands, even pleading to stay, as we just found out a couple hours ago. But I don't necessarily believe it's all Rodgers' fault, because even though he brought so much of this powerful mindset to this Jets team, I think that organizationally, they didn't look inward either and say, well, if we bring in Aaron Rodgers, we gotta bolster this team. And there are certain players on this team, and I'm not trying to name names, that I don't necessarily feel like fit the image of what the New York Jets were trying to build outside of Rodgers. So that's why I think this split is partially on Aaron Rodgers, potentially the majority of it being on him, but also you have to look at the organization. And I know that it's not necessarily going to taint completely the reputation of Aaron Glenn and Darren Mauge, because it's one of the first moves they made as the head coach and GM respectively for this new regime. But it does call into question where the Jets' priorities are, because I feel like there's more to worry about internally than just Aaron Rodgers. But enough about that, and let's talk about the after effects of this. Which teams could potentially be in the market to either trade for or acquire Aaron Rodgers? And I feel like there are only 3 specific teams that I'm going to talk about in brief here that I think make the most sense. Starting off with one we've talked about a lot at the GSMC Sports Network, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I know a lot of Pittsburgh Steelers fans would be irate if this went down, but I do believe that the Pittsburgh Steelers have a little bit more of a solid foundation for Aaron Rodgers, and I feel like they're not willing to completely go all in on either of Russ or Justin Fields, because Justin Fields might command a little bit more money than you would want to give out to him, even though out of all their options, he seemingly is the best potential option. And then Russ, obviously, there's a lot of talk about him potentially going elsewhere. As Splashboy says, Roger needs to go back into the darkness. If an NFL team takes him on, they have only themselves to blame for the toxins he brings. Well, that's the one caveat, right? Any one of these 3 teams has to know the baggage that Aaron Rodgers brings. But it's not like his stats are declining to the point where you don't want him. I mean, he had 28 touchdowns and almost 4,000 yards last year for that dysfunctional Jets organization. So you got to take the good with the bad. You got to pick your poison in some moments, and a couple of these franchises look like they could bite the bullet. In Pittsburgh, even though they're probably the least likely out of these 3 teams to go for him, even though there has been talks of the Steelers mulling this move, Mike Tomlin obviously has interesting relations with Aaron Rodgers. I do feel like if they decide to pursue him, it would be a nice little fit, because they're not necessarily a team that's going to be picking in, the top half of the draft in the next couple of years for as long as they're mired in mediocrity. So I feel like if Aaron Rodgers is the bridge, the next year's QB draft class, which is much deeper than this year's, could appeal to Pittsburgh in terms of development under Aaron Rodgers after he's there for a year or 2. But yeah, I think that Pittsburgh is going to definitely be one of the teams in the sweepstakes that either is going to emerge the front runner or fade into the background, just because I don't necessarily believe they'll put too much stock into pursuing Rodgers, because I personally feel like they believe in Justin Fields' development enough to invest in him and instill in him what they believe is necessary to be a starting quarterback for them. But you never know. And I feel like that's why this move for them won't make much sense. So then these next 2 teams could potentially be two candidates to emerge. And the first one being my personal front runner for services, at very least in my mind, the Tennessee Titans, because they're in a very weird situation. They're not necessarily as bad as their record suggests they are, but they are the team with the number 1 pick. But rumors have been the new GM, Mike Bergonzi, might want to trade out of that pick, gain more draft capital. But I do think that it's not with the intention of looking at any other QBs, whether it be this year or next year. I just think they want to gain as many picks as possible to try and rebuild this roster, add more talent to it. Because at the end of the day, Tennessee has way more problems than just the QB position. But I do think that a quote-unquote quick fix, at least for this season, could be Aaron Rodgers. And Will Levis is not necessarily going to be the it guy for you anymore, so why not? They have Calvin Ridley and Tony Pollard, nice pieces there, and not necessarily the worst of offensive lines for a team picking at number 1 overall. But I do believe that it is kind of hard to assess this Tennessee Titans team in terms of what they're thinking, because they also have a new regime, much like the team Aaron Rodgers is leaving. And a lot of these teams really are potentially looking for a clean slate and might not want the baggage that Aaron Rodgers brings, despite the fact that he can still put up stats for you. But I do think that Tennessee could emerge as an interesting candidate. And the last one, I don't necessarily believe that this will ultimately be the front runner, because they've been in on a couple of free agent guys, at least in the rumors I've heard, the Las Vegas Raiders. And the Las Vegas Raiders have the cap space. They don't necessarily have to pick really to do anything about the QB position. And I feel like the best way forward for them is to have a contingency plan and really just try and look at next year's draft for their next guy. And so I don't necessarily think that a guy like Pete Carroll would go all in on that plan, just because he likes building up the youth in his squad and using what he's got. But Aaron Rodgers would be an interesting fit there, especially if you're drafting someone next year like a Cade Klubnik or an Arch Manning, or even, say, a DJ Lagway or someone like that, and you want to develop him, and Aaron Rodgers could be that guy. But then again, you add all the dysfunctionality into it, and chances are it leaves you at square one if you're Las Vegas. So out of all these teams, Tennessee looks the most likely to bite the bullet and bring in Rodgers and all the baggage that comes with him. But really, it's going to be tough to determine how these teams view Rodgers on this market, even though it is a very weak one in free agency for quarterbacks this season. But ultimately, it's going to come down to how Aaron Rodgers views himself potentially on the market, and also how all these teams view their own internal plans and decide how Aaron Rodgers will fit into them in the long run. But let me know what you think in the comments below, if any other team should be in for Rodgers, or if he's someone who's not necessarily going to be a hot commodity. Because coming up next, we're going to transition to the NBA for just a little bit of time, talking about the true contenders for the Larry O'Brien Trophy after the conclusion of All-Star Weekend. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give